We do not only have economic effects starting from the world economic and financial crisis of 2008 to 2014, but also the entire superstructure has changed. First of all, this entire theory of neoliberalism has come into a deep crisis, and this then expressed itself in a major shift to the right of various imperialist governments. You can say that this shift to the right has become a general tendency of the entire imperialist world system, up to the point that there are single countries where fascists are in government that is not necessarily already fascism, but Orban is a fascist. He is in the government. Or we have a development in Poland or Trump, who is a fascist. He could govern in the largest imperialist country. But then we also have really fascist developments like in Myanmar, like in Turkey. However, on the other hand, we have a progressive change of mood, which directly confronts this direction. And the polarization between these two directions determines all of political life today. And in this situation, you have to see clearly. If you don't see clearly, you can't fight the battle resolutely and successfully. And that's what this book is all about. It is precisely because the world is full of crisis that the confusion among people is very great. You can see this in movements like the lateral thinkers movement. There's left and right, no one has a clear orientation anymore. The main thing is to be against the government, and that, of course, is a very problematic situation. At the same time, people are looking for a way out, for an alternative. And often they don't know yet which way they should go. And in this situation, the question of worldview, of ideology, is a crucial question: how people orient themselves and what conclusions they draw from the whole situation. The book addresses the broad mass of the population: workers, young people, women, and also people active in social movements. We have tried to write as understandably as possible, which is not always so easy with philosophical topics. But I think the most difficult thing about the book are the quotations from the bourgeois philosophers, who always write in particularly incomprehensible way so that no one can argue with them. Every individual has a mode of thinking, a personal world outlook with which they view the world, from which they draw conclusions, according to which they lead their lives. And this world outlook is influenced by all things in the world, by the entire universal being, of course, especially by the crisis proneness of imperialism that prevails today. But also from the two main ideologies, namely the struggle between proletarian and bourgeois ideology, between the petty bourgeois and the proletarian mode of thinking. It is one of the fundamental fictions of state monopoly capitalism that there are no more ideologies, no more isms. And this is, of course, complete nonsense. No human being lives without a world outlook. No society exists without a world outlook. No science can exist without the foundation of a world outlook. The world outlook is a fundamental orientation and guide for thinking, feeling, and acting in every kind of societal activity. And that is why it is necessary that you first come to terms with the fact that this fundamental fiction simply does not work. The bourgeois ideology also denies itself. From a historical point of view, bourgeois ideology was once very progressive when it defeated feudalism. Important achievements were made. I remind you of Hegel's dialectics, of materialism that emerged then, of the natural sciences, Beethoven's music, the German language. All these are products of this bourgeois ideology, which today are practically negated by the thesis of freedom from ideology. It's complete nonsense. If you do not approach the question in terms of world outlook, then you cannot really go into depth, into the essence of the matter, into the root cause of the things, and you also cannot draw any correct conclusions. After all, the history of bourgeois ideology is this. When the working class entered history, and since Marx and Engels, a proletarian ideology emerged, since then the bourgeois ideology had an opponent. And since then, it has also acquired a reactionary anti-communist character. And this reactionary character of bourgeois ideology also constitutes its essence. Anti-communism plays a gigantic role in all of history. Let's remember the anti-communism before World War I, which was very important to control the workers' movement. Fascism is the epitome of anti-communism. Its main goal was the destruction of Bolshevism in the entire world. The bankruptcy of fascism was, of course, also a bankruptcy of bourgeois ideology, and socialism gained great esteem. 1/3 of humankind lived in socialist countries, the old colonialism was defeated, and this led to flourishing of scientific socialism among the broad masses of the worldwide movement and the workers' movement, etc. And then anti-communism reacted to that again. It always reacts to progressive movements. Then came this turn in American policy towards Germany with reactionary anti-communism. Then all treaties were abrogated. The Potsdam Agreement was broken with the founding of Germany, with the division of Germany. And a tremendous anti-communist wave came in the world. I remind of the McCarthy era in the USA, where every creative artist, everyone working in the media, and every progressive person was systematically persecuted if they even appeared to have anything to do with communism, or if they ever spoke positively about socialism or communism. But this reactionary anti-communism always had a bad reputation within the workers' movement. The majority of the workers rejected it. And that's why, at the beginning of the 1950s, a democratic form of anti-communism already emerged, the so-called CCF Congress. It included certain people like Willy Brandt, or also certain artists, or from the Frankfurt School, or Trotskyites, or chastened old communists were among them, and then they substantiated this so-called democratic anti-communism. This development then continued. The next station was, for example, the SPD Party Congress in Godesberg, that dealt primarily with anti-communism, that detached itself from the revolutionary workers' movement. Since then, the SPD didn't even call itself a workers' party any longer, but a popular party instead. And this democratic anti-communism basically then characterized this SPD. Then came the student movement, when socialism again gained new esteem, but the answer to this was, for example, the Frankfurt School. Worldwide, this Frankfurt School actually has a progressive reputation, but that is not the case. These are really the theoreticians of this democratic anti-communism. They never held communist views. They always criticized communism. Then, of course, there was the Petit Bourgeois ML movement in the 1970s, which also failed again and was largely absorbed by the Greens. And these Greens, again, founded themselves on primarily anti-communist foundations. For example, they blamed democratic centralism for the failure of all these Petit Bourgeois ML organizations. Why? Because they had never really understood democratic centralism. They interpreted it as a pure leadership method, that the leaders are always right, etc., which is, of course, nonsense. Democratic centralism is a lively process of the consciousness formation of the party, of how its decisions come about and how they are implemented. These petty bourgeois leaders never understood that, and that is why they blamed democratic centralism for their failure. Then they developed the so-called grassroots democracy, which incidentally was also buried today again. It was never put into practice. No one has ever implemented grassroots democracy in the Greens. This was simply a farce. This continued in the 80s when the workers' movement took a new start. There were big workers' struggles. I remember the struggle for the 35-hour week, the big struggles in Rheinhausen, etc. And in that situation, a new form developed again, a left anti-communism. represented by left reformists who suddenly had the leadership in Rheinhausen. And in Rheinhausen, for the first time, these people were given some leeway by the trade union. Before, they were fought against. The left reformists have been excluded from the trade union with their alternative works council lists. Now they were needed to build a dam against scientific socialism, which was becoming more and more interesting for the people. With all the strike experience, more and more workers said, things aren't working at all with this capitalist system, we need something else, and actually turned toward socialism. That was like an emergency brake, and from that arose a modern anti-communism, which on the one hand has progressive claims, criticizes capitalism, criticizes exploitation, demands democratic rights, denounces all the evils of capitalism, but at the same time says, but communism has failed, and there is still Stalinism and Maoism, be careful, so that can't be it either. And this modern anti-communism is what the workers' movement has to deal with today. It is a very dangerous thing because for the first time modern anti-communism has succeeded in penetrating deeply into the workers' movement and into the broad masses. This was not possible with reactionary anti-communism. And this is the great significance of this modern anti-communism, that it has a practically inhibiting effect on the development of class consciousness and on the development of the class struggle, also among the working class movement, among the masses. It appears today in very diverse forms. For once, it has actually become the central question in the government program of the petty bourgeois mode of thinking. But it appears in all movements. This reformism is very anti-communist. In the women's movement, petty bourgeois feminism has an anti-communist orientation. The petty bourgeois environmental movement has an anti-communist orientation. The petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking has many shades, and across the whole spectrum of social movements and the working class movement, the youth movement, very specific forms of a petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking are appearing, building a veritable dam against the consciousness raising of the masses. The book ends with a chapter on the great proletarian cultural revolution. Here it deals with the question of how in all of society the superiority of scientific socialism over the remnants of bourgeois ideology can be organized in a socialist society. We have the negative experience of 1956, of the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU, where Khrushchev more or less threw Marxism-Leninism overboard, and a restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, and subsequently also in the GDR and the other countries of the Comecon was initiated. This restoration of capitalism had modern revisionism as its ideological foundation. This blurs the difference between scientific socialism and bourgeois ideology and is basically only a new form of bourgeois ideology. There was a similar development in China. To come to cope with this development, Mao Zedong proclaimed the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1966 and called on the masses to cast off this revisionism and take the next step forward to socialism. This was a huge ideological struggle involving millions of masses. Young people went to the countryside to develop ties to the peasants and not simply aim their studies to their careers. They learned from the peasants. They also taught the peasants. They developed medical systems in the countryside, realized ecological projects. They naturally criticized these party leaders, as Mao Zedong says, bourgeois bureaucrats with a party book in their pockets, who were not at all easy to spot because, of course, they always propounded socialist phrases and were not easy to recognize. The workers, the students, the peasants, they criticized this and also deposed some of these people. There were huge crocodile tears, but the Cultural Revolution is always portrayed as a giant massacre where millions of people died, which is complete nonsense. I have been active in the revolutionary movement for more than 50 years now, and I know that at that time, even in the bourgeois press, the Cultural Revolution had great esteem. The Spiegel, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Frankfurter Rundschau, they all wrote wonderful articles about the great proletarian cultural revolution in which their correspondents took part themselves. So this was not the continuation of communist propaganda that gained influence there, but instead these were their observations as bourgeois journalists. Later, after the death of Mao Zedong and with the restoration of capitalism in China, of course, a tremendous smear campaign began and a tremendous falsification of history, similar to what we experienced at the times of Lenin and Stalin, in order to build up reservations against socialism. But this chapter on the great proletarian cultural revolution makes it clear once again how important the ideological struggle, the struggle over the mode of thinking is. There is no victory of socialism that does not take place on the basis of the proletarian mode of thinking and scientific socialism. Without the proletarian mode of thinking as a basis, there is no socialism, no further development towards communism. This youth movement can be seen all over the world, in the USA, in the Myanmar, where you can see that these are young people who are fighting there, especially against the military dictatorship. This is a worldwide phenomenon, but it is a spontaneous movement. And there we have the problem again that you do not get to socialism simply spontaneously. That is much more difficult today. Because of all of these influences, the system of the petty bourgeois mode of thinking in society as a method of government, this spontaneous movement can be manipulated very easily. I see this in Fridays for Future. That was a justified worldwide protest that captured millions of young people, but they still managed to recruit a majority of those people to promote their Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement is not sufficient to prevent an environmental catastrophe or climate catastrophe. There must be a society-changing struggle. We should not have any illusions that we can actually wage an effective struggle against the development towards a global environmental catastrophe within the framework of this system. And this is a problem that these young people do not spontaneously come to such an understanding. This requires a struggle over world outlook. And I believe that this book can make an important contribution to going more deeply into these things and not following superficial platitudes from the Greens or bourgeois politicians who today have all pinned the fight to save the climate for their chests. You need your own head for that, and they can only get it if they free themselves ideologically from modern anti-communism and turn to scientific socialism and proletarian mode of thinking and working. Well, at the moment we are conducting an important ideological campaign, namely, don't give anti-communism a chance. In the meantime, more than 10,000 well-known people have signed and declared their solidarity with the movement, also far beyond the circle of our supporters, from progressive organizations, from the trade unions, from the Left Party, the DKP, the VVN, but also creative artists. The main purpose of this campaign is to develop awareness of the fundamental importance of coping with anti-communism and the petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking today. There will be no further development of the environmental movement, the class struggle of the workers, the women's movement, the youth movement, the proletarian internationalism, without coping with this modern anti-communism and the petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking. The book is a real manual for this movement. It makes a very comprehensive analysis and also shows the weakness of anti-communism, whose half-life has been shortening more and more. A new wave of anti-communism came up again and again with new faces, new variants, and then, after a short time, they had to renew anti-communism again and again and again until today. But despite this, anti-communism is in crisis. It cannot answer people's questions properly anymore. And of course, we have to make use of that. And that's what this campaign is aiming at. That's what this book is aiming at. And that's why this book fits perfectly into the time. In fact, it has taken 7 years since we issued the last number of the theoretical organ on the global environmental catastrophe. And this has mainly something to do with the fact that this is a very complex subject. The struggle between proletarian and bourgeois ideology, which according to bourgeois interpretations supposedly does not exist, is so all-encompassing. There are thousands of channels through which bourgeois ideology reaches the masses, the people, the youth, the workers. We studied all of this, the whole spectrum. In the first book, we first dealt with anti-communism again. In the next books, we will deal with newer theories that have appeared, but of course also with new revisionist and reformist theories. In the meantime, reformism is not only represented by the SPD, but also by the Greens, the Left Party, the CDU, and this is of course also a new situation that reformism has become common to all bourgeois parties. But we also deal with the revisionist ideas of Öcalan's Democratic Confederation, which I think is also disarming the Kurdish liberation struggle. It is a disaster. This theory contributes a lot to the fact that, for one thing, the Kurdish movement has isolated itself, but that it has also suffered defeats in recent times. The Kurdish liberation struggle must break away from this revisionism if it really wants to be successful. We also deal again with neo-fascist ideologies, with the question of conspiracy theories, etc. All this will be dealt with in the second volume. In the third volume, we want to direct attention mainly to culture and science. There we also deal with psychology, with pedagogy, with the science of history, with religion, and with various fields of public life, which contribute essentially to the fact that bourgeois ideology is spread among the masses again and again. And in the last book, which is actually the quintessence of our series, we deal with the doctrine of the mode of thinking. What conclusions we have to draw for the ideological struggle in the struggle over the mode of thinking of the masses. What significance all this has today. Today, those who do not come to cope with the petit bourgeois mode of thinking will not organize themselves. They will not take part in the struggle. They will try to wind their way somehow. They will propound progressive ideas, but they will never wage a resolute struggle against this system. Today it is important to discuss and to deal with the entire complicated question of the ideological struggle. This will essentially include all the different sides of the doctrine of the mode of thinking. And the doctrine of the mode of thinking is also a further development of dialectical and historical materialism. On the one hand, it deals with the analysis of the mode of thinking of the masses as a certain starting point for the ideological struggle. What categories appear there? You can't just start blurting out things. You have to think very carefully about how to wage this ideological struggle so that it is also successful. But it also deals with a certain culture of debate that is needed, with a proletarian culture of debate which is necessary for the persuasive power in the ideological struggle. But we also need a form of organization. We need scientific work to conduct this ideological struggle. This cannot be done spontaneously without organization, without a scientific organization of work, without a Marxist style of work, without a proletarian method of work. Because the proletarian mode of thinking is realized first of all through collective activity. And collective can only function in an organized organized way. Otherwise, only chaos comes out. And last but not least, we need a method to check ourselves again and again how far we are also influenced by the bourgeois ideology and by a petty bourgeois mode of thinking. That's why the method of control and self-control plays such a big role, because this control and self-control is a method to develop oneself, to cope with the bourgeois influence, with modern anticommunism, with petty bourgeois feminism, with petty bourgeois ecologism, and so on. This method of control and self-control is fundamental today for any development of a movement, a progressive movement, a revolutionary movement for the struggle for socialism, for the preparation of the international revolution, but also for the construction of socialism on the road to communism. In the meantime, the international revolutionary and working class movement is also very interested in this theoretical work, in the substance of theoretical work of the MLPD, and many of our books have meanwhile been translated and distributed worldwide. Today, our books are distributed, read and studied in 9 languages and 57 countries of the world, and are also seen as an incentive to draw their own theoretical conclusions from the societal development. And this book is also being translated with full steam, and I assume that we can count with an English edition, a French, Russian and a Spanish edition already in the summer. The exchange of our theoretical insights with other theoretical insights that exist in the international revolutionary working class movement is fundamental today. Otherwise, there will be no international socialist revolution if you do not exchange, if we don't learn from each other, if we don't grasp the different situations and also understand the views of the allies, and so on. In this respect, we place a lot of emphasis on organizing proletarian internationalism. We work very intensively in the ICOR, the international organization of meanwhile 62 parties and organizations on all 5 continents, which has undertaken the task of coordinating and agreeing on its practical activities across borders. And we also work in a leading role in an international united front against war and fascism, against this rightward development which exists internationally, and in which 500 organizations are participating in the meantime. So this is a real world movement, and all these people have a very great interest in our theoretical work. We have inquiries, they work with translations, they are already waiting, they know that this book is being worked out, and they are already asking when it's coming out, and so on and so forth. And so we have a certain obligation. And we also already have the ambition to also take up and generalize the experiences in the international revolutionary and working class movement. This is a reciprocal process that is of fundamental importance. In addition to the campaign Don't Give Anticommunism a Chance, we will of course participate again in the upcoming federal elections, and in this fight we will also spread this book very offensively and attack this modern anti-communism. One has to fight for this, and we will also offer all possible help so that a real study movement takes place. We won't get anywhere if people don't come to cope with this modern anti-communism, above all with this petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking. Sometimes it's just a feeling, there is something there, people say we are okay, they find everything nice, what we say is good, but then somehow there is something wrong. Such feelings keep thousands of people from becoming members of our party today. These reservations are actually the main problem among the masses. Not even necessarily such a conscious anti-communist thinking. That is not the problem among the masses, but these petty bourgeois reservations. In the federal election campaign, we will combine our ideas of a different world in which humanity should live with coming to terms with this. We will encourage people not to be negatively influenced by such manipulations. and to make use of their own heads.